Welcome to Eternal Darkness, where nightmares come to life. I'll be your host through these twisted tales tonight. Before we descend into the shadows, remember to like and subscribe to join our growing community of horror enthusiasts. Get comfortable, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself as we begin our journey into the unknown. The late autumn of 1978 found me standing in a cramped attorney's office in downtown Portland, watching my mother's face cycle through expressions I'd never seen before. She sat rigid in the leather chair beside me, her fingers worrying the clasp of her handbag while my brother Thomas leaned against the door frame, arms crossed, face unreadable. Our father had been dead for 3 weeks. The attorney, a thin man named Brennan with wire-rimmed glasses and a perpetual throat-clearing habit, shuffled through papers on his desk. As I mentioned, Mr. Walsh's estate is relatively straightforward. The house in Crescent City, the vehicle, some savings, modest, given his previous circumstances, and then there's this. He slid a document across the desk. My mother didn't reach for it, so I did. A cabin? I asked, scanning the legal description. In Siskiyou County? Near a place called Black Marble Mountain, Brennan confirmed. About 20 miles south of Happy Camp. One-room structure built in 1963 according to county records, with significant modifications completed in 1976. He paused, consulting his notes. Your father had the property transferred to his name that same year, and apparently made several improvements to the structure. My mother's laugh was sharp and bitter. Improvements? Of course he did. While his sons needed school clothes and I worked double shifts at the hospital, James was building himself a little hideaway in the mountains. Mom, Thomas started, but she cut him off with a look. I want it sold, she said flatly. Everything. The house, the car, that shack in the woods, all of it. Wait, I interjected. Can we at least see what's there first? She turned that same cutting gaze on me. What's there, Paul, is exactly what I told you when we went through his house in Crescent City. Empty bottles and garbage. Your father spent the last 7 years of his life drinking himself to death in various locations. And this is just one more place he did it. But something in Brennan's expression made me press further. Did he go there often? Are there records of that? The attorney shifted uncomfortably. The property taxes were paid regularly, and there are receipts for supplies purchased in Happy Camp dating back to quite a lot of supplies, actually. Camping equipment, non-perishables, water purification tablets. He seems to have made the trip several times a year. Doing what? Thomas asked from the doorway. Brennan shook his head. That I couldn't tell you. My mother stood abruptly. I don't care what he was doing. Sell it all. I want nothing from that man except what he should have given us when we needed it. Money. She left the office without another word. Thomas followed after a moment, shooting me an apologetic shrug. But I stayed, staring at that property deed, at the coordinates and legal descriptions that meant nothing to me but apparently had meant everything to my father. Mr. Brennan, I said slowly, if I wanted to visit the cabin before we made any decisions, how would I do that? He leaned back in his chair, studying me over those wire-rimmed glasses. It's not easy to access. No road goes directly to it. You'd need to park in Happy Camp or somewhere nearby and hike in. I'd estimate 5 miles, maybe more, through difficult terrain. He paused. Your father was an experienced outdoorsman? No, I admitted. Not that I ever knew about. He worked in accounting, spent his weekends reading the paper and watching baseball. Interesting, Brennan murmured. Because someone who wasn't experienced would find that hike quite challenging, especially making it multiple times a year for 7 years. That conversation haunted me for weeks. I couldn't stop thinking about my father, the man I'd known who wore short-sleeved dress shirts and kept his hair neatly trimmed, who'd taught me to balance a checkbook but never how to pitch a tent, transforming into someone who would spend days alone in the wilderness. The same man who'd called me drunk on my 26th birthday 6 months before his death, rambling about sacrifices and doing what was right even when it cost you everything. Sometimes a man has to do what's right, he'd said, his words slurred but oddly intense. Even if it means sacrificing everything he's worked for. You might not understand till you're a father yourself. At the time, I'd chalked it up to whiskey talking. Now I wasn't so sure. Thomas wanted nothing to do with investigating the cabin. Let it go, Paul, he'd said over beers one night. Dad made his choices. We made ours. There's nothing up there but old regrets and empty bottles. But I couldn't let it go. Maybe it was because I'd been closer to Dad before the divorce. Or maybe it was because his last words to me felt like an incomplete sentence that I needed to finish. Either way, by October of 1985, I'd made my decision. I was going to the cabin. Preparing for the trip took longer than I'd anticipated. I'd grown up in suburbs and cities, comfortable with sidewalks and streetlights, with restaurants and movie theaters. My idea of roughing it was a hotel without room service. The wilderness my father had apparently embraced was as foreign to me as another country. I started with books from the library, hiking guides, wilderness survival manuals, topographical map reading. I bought equipment from an outdoor supply store where a bearded employee named Gary took pity on my obvious inexperience and walked me through the basics. "You're going alone?" he asked, frowning at my list. "First time backpacking?" "It's just for one night," I assured him. "Maybe two." "That's how people die out there," he said bluntly. "One night unprepared. You get lost, break an ankle, run into a bear. It only takes one mistake." His words should have deterred me. Instead, they made me think of my father making this journey repeatedly, alone for 7 years. What had driven him? What had he been looking for? I bought a good backpack, a sleeping bag rated for cold weather, water purification tablets, a first aid kit, non-perishable food, a reliable flashlight with extra batteries, and a topographical map of the area around Black Marble Mountain. Gary convinced me to take a compass and taught me the basics of navigation. He also suggested I inform someone of my plans and expected return date. "If you're not back when you said you'd be, they can send help," he explained. I nodded, though I wasn't sure who I'd tell. My mother would just lecture me about wasting time on a fool's errand. Thomas would try to talk me out of it. In the end, I decided I'd inform the local ranger station when I arrived. The drive north took most of a day. I left Portland before dawn, watching the city lights fade in my rearview mirror as I headed into increasingly rural territory. The landscape gradually transformed from the Willamette Valley's gentle farmland to the rugged mountains of southern Oregon and northern California. By the time I reached Happy Camp in the late afternoon, my back ached and my eyes burned from hours of concentration on winding mountain roads. The town was smaller than I'd expected, a handful of buildings clustered along Highway 96 with the Klamath River running swift and cold beside them. I stopped at a gas station where a woman with weathered hands and kind eyes gave me directions to a whitewater rafting company on the edge of town. "They let folks park there sometimes," she said. "Long as you ask nice and maybe leave a few dollars for the trouble." The rafting company, a modest operation consisting of a small office, a storage shed, and a gravel parking area, was run by a man named Bill, who looked to be in his 60s, with sun-darkened skin and calloused hands. When I explained what I was doing, he studied me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Your daddy's cabin," he said slowly. "Yeah, I remember him. Quiet guy. Kept to himself. Used to park here regular, starting back in 76 or so." My heart quickened. Did he ever talk about what he was doing up there? Bill shook his head. "Never said more than hello and thank you. But I'll tell you something odd. That first year, 76, he'd go up for a day or two at a time. By 78, 79, he was spending a week at a stretch. Last couple years, he trailed off, scratching his jaw. Last couple years, I got the feeling he was up there more than he was down here." "Did he ever mention anyone else being up there?" I asked. "Another person?" Bill's eyes sharpened. "Why would you ask that?" "Just something I'm curious about." He was quiet for a long moment, studying me. Finally, he said, "Your daddy asked me questions once. Back in maybe 77. Asked if I'd heard stories about folks living wild in the mountains. Said he'd seen someone, and wanted to know if other people had too." The hair on the back of my neck prickled. "What did you tell him?" "Told him the truth. That there've been stories long as I've been here. Hermits mostly, people who don't want to be found. Most of them are harmless. They stay away from town, live off the land, don't bother nobody." He paused. "But there's one story that's been around longer than the others, about a man with red hair who lost his mind up in those mountains back in the early 60s. "Lost his mind how?" Bill shrugged. "Depends who's telling it. Some say he went up there with his family on vacation and they all died in some accident. Car went off a cliff or something and he couldn't handle it. Just walked away from everything and never came back. Others say he was always a little strange and the isolation just made it worse. Point is, people have been seeing him for 20 years or more. Always naked, always dirty, always alone." "Has he ever hurt anyone?" "Not that I've heard. Scares folks, though." And Bill hesitated. "Your daddy, that last year before he died, he looked haunted, if you don't mind me saying. Like whatever he'd been doing up there had taken something out of him." I thanked Bill and spent the night in Happy Camp's only motel. a rundown place that smelled of mildew and cigarette smoke. I barely slept, lying awake in the darkness, thinking about my father hiking into those mountains again and again, tracking a man who'd lost everything, who lived like an animal in the woods. Why? What was he trying to accomplish? And why had it consumed him so completely that he'd abandoned his family, his career, everything that mattered? The questions circled in my mind like carrion birds. And when I finally did sleep, my dreams were confused and troubling. Images of my father standing in the woods calling a name I couldn't quite hear while something moved through the trees just beyond his vision. I left my car at the rafting company just after sunrise. Bill was already there checking equipment for the day's tours. He watched me shoulder my backpack and adjust the straps, then handed me a small two-way radio. "It's old and the range isn't great," he said, "but if you get into trouble and you're anywhere near the western side of that mountain, I might be able to hear you. Channel 7. I tried to hand it back. "I can't take your equipment." "Your daddy used to borrow it too," Bill said quietly. "Returned it every time. Figure you will too." I thanked him, clipped the radio to my belt, and set off. The first mile was easy enough. A maintained trail that followed an old logging road, relatively flat and wide. But then the trail narrowed and began to climb, and I understood why my father would have needed to be in good shape for this journey. The backpack, which had felt reasonable in Bill's parking lot, quickly became a burden. Sweat soaked through my shirt despite the cool November air. My thighs burned. My breath came in harsh gasps. I stopped frequently to consult the topographical map and the hand-drawn directions Brennan had provided, which my father had apparently given to his attorney years earlier. The instructions were precise, almost obsessively so. Turn north at the lightning-struck pine. Follow the stream until you reach a pile of stones shaped like a cairn. Look for the game trail that cuts east through the blackberry thickets. My father had known this route intimately, had walked it enough times to note every landmark, every turn. The thought should have been comforting. I was following in his footsteps after all. But instead it unnerved me. Each landmark felt like a breadcrumb he'd left behind, not to guide me home but to lead me deeper into something I didn't understand. By early afternoon I'd covered maybe 3 miles. My water was running low despite my attempts to ration it. The stream my father's directions mentioned appeared ahead, cutting through a small ravine, and I stopped to refill my canteen. The water was clear and cold, flowing over smooth stones. I added purification tablets and forced myself to wait the required 30 minutes before drinking, even though my throat felt like sandpaper. While I waited, I noticed something odd. On a large boulder near the stream, someone had carved a series of marks, straight lines, grouped in sets of 5, counting marks. I walked around the boulder and found more on the other side, dozens of them, maybe over 100. Someone had been here many times and had counted each visit. My father? Or someone else? I ran my fingers over the marks, weathered but still visible, and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. The last 2 miles were the hardest. The terrain became increasingly rough, forcing me to scramble over fallen logs and navigate through dense thickets that grabbed at my clothes and backpack. I got turned around twice, wasting nearly an hour retracing my steps before finding the correct path again. By the time the trees began to thin and I caught my first glimpse of the cabin in the distance, the sun was already starting its descent toward the horizon. Long shadows stretched across the clearing, and the temperature was dropping noticeably. The cabin looked worse than I'd imagined. From a distance, it appeared to be slowly collapsing in on itself, the roof sagging, the walls covered in dark stains that could have been moss or mold or something worse. The single visible window gaped like an empty eye socket. Deep gouges marred the wooden walls, and I could see what looked like antler scrapes where bucks had used it as a rubbing post. But as I got closer, I noticed details that suggested the structure was more solid than it appeared. The door, though weathered, sat square in its frame. The foundation looked level, and those gouges in the walls, they were only on the front face, nowhere else, as if something had focused its attention specifically on the entrance. I tried the door, expecting it to stick or creak open reluctantly. Instead, it moved smoothly on well-oiled hinges, and I understood immediately that my father had maintained this place carefully despite its ramshackle appearance. The door itself was surprisingly heavy. When I pushed it fully open and looked at the interior side, I saw why. Someone had reinforced it with metal plates, screwed and bolted into place. The wood beneath was thick, at least 2 inches of solid timber. This wasn't a door meant to keep out animals. I stepped inside, and my breath caught in my throat. The interior of the cabin was a testament to obsession. Every available surface was covered in maps, photographs, and handwritten notes. They overlapped each other, creating layers of information that would take hours to sort through. The single room was maybe 12 by 15 feet, with a canvas cot in one corner, a small table and chair in another, and a wood stove that looked functional despite its rust. But it was the walls that held my attention. The maps were topographical, covering the area in a radius of what looked like 10 to 15 miles from the cabin. Someone, my father presumably, had marked them extensively with colored pens. Routes were traced in different colors with dates written beside them in tight, careful handwriting. Grid squares were circled or crossed out. Notes were scribbled in the margins. Adding 1276. Found tracks near the creek. 9376. Possible shelter under the rock overhang, marked with X. Will contact in 3 weeks. Weather. The dates started in 1976 and continued through to early 1985, just months before my father's death. 7 years of documentation, of tracking, of searching. But tracking whom? The photographs provided the answer. They were pinned to the walls between the maps, and they all showed the same man, someone with bright red hair and a thick beard, wearing various combinations of hiking clothes. In the earliest photos, he looked healthy and happy. One showed him with what appeared to be a wife and 2 children, all of them smiling at the camera in front of a camping tent. Another showed him alone, grinning as he held up a large fish. But the progression of photographs told a disturbing story. In later images, the man looked thinner, his smile forced. His clothes became increasingly rumpled and dirty. His hair grew longer, more unkempt. The family disappeared from the photos entirely. And then there were the photographs that looked like surveillance images, grainy, taken from a distance with a telephoto lens. The red-haired man standing motionless in a stream, staring at nothing. The same man crouched beside what might have been a dead animal. Another showing him from behind, walking through the forest, his posture somehow wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. In these later images, he was completely naked, his pale skin visible through streaks of dirt and what might have been dried blood. His hair had become a wild tangle down to his shoulders. His beard reached his chest. The most recent photograph, dated March 1985, showed him standing perhaps 50 feet from the camera, facing it directly. His eyes were wide and empty. His mouth hung open. His hands dangled at his sides, fingers curled into loose fists. He looked like he'd forgotten how to be human. I pulled the photograph down, flipping it over. On the back, my father had written, "He sees me now, knows I'm here. Time is short." Time is short for what? I began searching the cabin more thoroughly, looking for something that would explain what my father had been trying to accomplish. Under the cot, I found empty bottles, just like my mother had predicted, but also journals. 3 of them, leather-bound, filled with my father's handwriting. The first entry was dated April 15, 1976. Saw him today for the first time. I'd heard the stories in Happy Camp about the wild man in the mountains, but I didn't believe them until now. I was hiking near Pine Creek, testing out the new sleeping bag I bought, when I saw someone moving through the trees about 100 yards away. I called out thinking it was another hiker, but he ran. I got a good look at him though, red hair, naked as the day he was born, moving through the forest like he'd done it 1,000 times. Bill at the rafting company says his name is, or was, Gregory Walsh. No relation to me, just coincidence of names. He came up here with his wife and 2 kids in 1962 for a summer vacation. Family was driving back down the mountain when another car crossed the center line on one of the switchbacks. Head-on collision. Wife and both children were killed instantly. Gregory survived without a scratch. Story goes he attended the funerals, sold his house, gave away all his possessions, and then walked back up into these mountains. That was 1963. He's been up here for 13 years now, living like an animal. Bill says rangers have tried to bring him in a few times, but he always disappears deeper into the woods. Eventually they gave up. Figured if a man wants to die in the wilderness, that's his choice to make. But I don't think Gregory wants to die. I think he's trying to punish himself, and I think I might be able to help him. I sat on the edge of the cot, the journal trembling in my hands. My father had known this man's name, his history, had apparently decided to, what, save him? Bring him back to civilization? I flipped through the pages, reading entry after entry. My father had become obsessed with finding Gregory, with documenting his movements, with trying to make contact. The entries revealed a pattern of behavior that chilled me. Left food near his shelter. He wouldn't take it while I was nearby. Came back the next day, food was gone but scattered, like he'd picked through it and thrown most of it away. 6/18/76. Built this cabin. Put it right in the middle of his territory. I need a base of operations if I'm going to help him. The land was cheap and the improvements are basic but functional. The door needs to be strong. I've seen what he does when he's agitated. 7/30/76. Contact. He came right up to the cabin last night. I heard him outside for hours. He was trying to open the door, banging on it with his fists, his head, anything. I tried talking to him through the wood, but he wouldn't respond. Or couldn't. I'm not sure he remembers how to speak anymore. 9/15/76, 9/14. Are nearly an hour, perfectly still, just staring downstream. I got close enough to really see him for the first time. His body is covered in scars, looks like he's been attacked by animals multiple times. His fingernails are thick and cracked. His teeth are rotting. But his eyes are the worst part. They're not vacant exactly, but they're not quite present either. It's like he's looking at something the rest of us can't see. The entries continued, year after year, showing my father's growing obsession. He wrote about Gregory's patterns, his behavior, his apparent territories. He documented seasonal changes in where Gregory could be found. He noted what appeared to be deterioration in Gregory's physical and mental state. And gradually, disturbingly, the entries began to show my father's own deterioration. 3/12/78. Susan filed for divorce papers. Can't blame her. I've been spending more time up here than at home. Boys probably think I've abandoned them. Maybe I have. But what am I supposed to do? If I don't try to help Gregory, who will? He's been up here for 16 years. How many more before he's too far gone to save? 8/4/79. Lost my job. Wasn't surprised. Been calling in sick too much. Missing deadlines. Told them I needed to take care of a sick relative. Not exactly a lie. Gregory is sick, even if he's not my relative. Even if he doesn't know I'm trying to help him. 11/30/80. Tried to approach him while he was sleeping. Worst mistake I've made yet. He woke up when I was about 10 feet away and came at me like a wild animal. Had to use the gun to scare him off. Fired a shot over his head. He ran, but I saw his face. He looked betrayed. Took me 3 months to see him again after that. I set the first journal down and picked up the second. My hands shaking. The dates jumped forward to 1982. 2/14/4/82. Made a breakthrough. He took food from my hand today. Didn't eat it in front of me, just grabbed it and ran. But it's progress. Small steps. I have to remember that every small step is a victory. He's watching the cabin. I can feel him out there, even when I can't see him. Sometimes I hear him moving around at night, circling the building. He never tries to get in anymore, just circles, like he's studying me the way I've been studying him. I spoke to him today. Really spoke. Full sentences. He was standing by the creek and I approached slowly, hands visible, no sudden movements. I told him my name. Told him I knew his name too. Told him about his wife and children, about the accident, about how it wasn't his fault. He just stared at me the whole time. But when I said his wife's name, Caroline, his mouth moved, like he was trying to remember how to form the word. I think he's still in there. I think I can bring him back. The next entry wasn't until 6 months later. 4/15/83. Bad reaction today. Very bad. I mentioned Caroline again, and he went insane. Screaming or something like screaming. More like an animal howling. He charged at me, and I had to lock myself in the cabin. He spent the entire night ramming himself against the door. The metal plates held. Thank God, but I could hear him injuring himself. In the morning there was blood on the door and on the ground outside. He was gone. Haven't seen him since. I'm worried I pushed too hard, too fast. I flipped pages, looking for the next entry. It was dated 3 months later. He came back last night. Woke me up standing outside the window. Just staring in. Scared me so badly I almost fired the gun. But I controlled myself. Stayed still. Let him look. After a while he left. I think he was trying to decide if I was safe. I hope he decided I am. The entries became more sporadic after that, with weeks or months between them. My father's handwriting became less careful, more rushed. The tone shifted from hope to desperation. 11/9/8. Winter coming. He won't survive it if he doesn't remember how to seek shelter. Found his latest sleeping place, just a depression under some rocks. No bedding, no warmth. How is he still alive? 3/22/84. Spring. He survived. Barely. Saw him today. And he's thinner than ever. Moving slowly. I tried to approach, but he ran. Maybe I waited too long. Maybe I should have forced the issue years ago. Gave up my house in Crescent City. Couldn't afford it anymore, and I wasn't using it anyway. Staying up here full time now. If Gregory dies, I'll be here. If he finally lets me help him, I'll be here. Either way, this is where I need to be. The final entry in the second journal was dated December 1984. He knows I'm here for him. I can see it in the way he watches the cabin. He's waiting for something. For me to give up? For Winter to kill one of us? I don't know, but I won't give up. I came too close to abandon him now. The third journal had only a handful of entries, all from 19... Nearly died last week. Got sick, fever and chills. Ran out of food. Was too weak to hike out. Thought about using the radio to call for help, but couldn't bring myself to do it. What would I tell them? That I'm starving to death in a cabin while watching a man who's been feral for 23 years. They'd think I was insane. Maybe I am. Gregory saved my life. I woke up one morning and there was food outside the cabin door. Deer meat, raw but fresh. He must have killed it and brought it to me. He was watching when I took it. I saw him in the trees. I held up the meat and said thank you. He didn't respond, but he didn't run either. I cooked the meat and ate it, and slowly got my strength back. He brought more twice over the next week. Always at night, always left at the door. I think he understands now. Not with words maybe, but with something deeper. We're connected, him and me. Two men who've lost everything, living in the woods together. Maybe I can't bring him back. Maybe that's not even what he wants. But I can be here. I can witness him. I can prove that someone still cares about Gregory, even if Gregory doesn't care about himself anymore. The remaining entries were short, almost fragmentary. 2/14. Heard him crying last night. At least I think it was crying. Could have been the wind. Turker. He 5C touched the cabin door today. Just put his hand flat against it and stood there for a minute, then left. Don't know what it means. 4/18 saw my reflection in the creek today. Barely recognized myself. Hair too long. Beard too wild. Lost so much weight. I look like him now. Maybe that was the point all along. Maybe to understand Gregory, I had to become Gregory. The final entry was dated May 2, 1985, just weeks before my father's death. Time to go home. Not to give up, but to rest. To remember who I was before all this. Called Paul on his birthday. Wanted to explain, but how do you explain something like this? How do you tell your son that you abandoned him because you couldn't abandon a stranger? I don't have a good answer. Maybe there isn't one. We'll come back in a few weeks. Gregory will wait. He always waits. I wish I could make him understand that I'm trying to help. That someone sees him, knows him, remembers who he was. Maybe that's enough. Maybe it has to be. I closed the journal and sat in silence. My father's words echoing in my mind. He'd spent 7 years trying to save a man who couldn't or wouldn't be saved. Had bankrupted himself, destroyed his family, sacrificed his health and sanity. For what? I stood and walked to the window, staring out at the darkening forest. Evening was coming on fast, shadows lengthening and merging. And somewhere out there, if Bill's stories were true, if my father's documentation was accurate, Gregory was still here, still naked, still feral, still trapped in whatever hell he'd built for himself after his family died. My father's final words to me suddenly made terrible sense. Sometimes a man has to do what's right, even if it means sacrificing everything. He'd believed helping Gregory was right, had believed it so deeply that he'd given up everything else in his life to pursue it. Had it been worth it? I didn't have an answer, and I wasn't sure I wanted one. But as I turned away from the window, as the last light of day faded, and darkness crept into the cabin, I found myself thinking about that deer meat Gregory had brought, about him touching the cabin door, about a man who'd been lost for 23 years recognizing, even just for a moment, that someone cared. Maybe my father had been crazy. Maybe his obsession had destroyed him. Or maybe, in some small way, he'd accomplished exactly what he'd set out to do. I'd never know for sure. I'd brought food, trail mix, beef jerky, some freeze-dried meals that just needed hot water, and I heated one of them on the small camping stove I'd packed. The wood stove in the cabin looked functional, but I didn't want to risk lighting it and drawing attention. The sun was already below the horizon, and the temperature was dropping fast. As I ate, I continued examining the cabin by the light of my electric lantern. In the desk drawer, I found what I'd been half expecting. A revolver. It was a hefty .44 caliber, well maintained despite the dusty cabin. A box of ammunition sat beside it, about half full. My father had felt the need to go armed. I checked the cylinder empty and set it on the table beside me. I had no intention of loading it unless absolutely necessary, but knowing it was there provided a small measure of comfort. The maps continued to fascinate and disturb me in equal measure. The annotations grew more detailed over the years, tracking Gregory's movements with meticulous care. Some grid squares had multiple notes. 6777. Found him here, midday, digging in the dirt with his hands. Couldn't tell what he was looking for. Same location. Still digging. He's made a hole about 3 feet deep. Watched for 2 hours, but he never stopped. 6977. Hole is filled in. He's gone. Check the site. Nothing in the hole but dirt and rocks. What was he doing? Other notes were more ominous. 82379 found remains of what I think was a dog. Signs of struggle. Can't tell if Gregory killed it or found it dead. Don't want to think about the first option. 101580. Heard him making sounds tonight. Not words. Not exactly animal noises either. Something in between. He was close to the cabin. Very close. He knows when I'm here. He's getting bolder. Stood outside the window for hours last night watching me. Didn't try to get in. Just watched. I tried to sleep but couldn't with him right there. Eventually he left, but I'm not sure when. Didn't hear him go. One map, dated 1984, had a large area circled in red with the note, "He's claimed this territory, reacts aggressively to intrusion, avoid." The cabin sat right at the edge of that circled area. As darkness fully settled over the forest, I found myself growing increasingly uneasy. The cabin's single window, despite its shutter, felt vulnerable. The door, despite its reinforcement, suddenly seemed inadequate. Every sound from outside, wind in the trees, branches scraping together, the distant call of an owl, made me freeze and listen. I was being paranoid, I told myself. Gregory might not even be in the area. According to my father's final entries, he ranged over several square miles. The chances of him being near the cabin tonight, the one night I happened to be there, were slim. But I still found myself checking the door repeatedly, making sure it was bolted. Still positioned my chair so I could see both the door and the window. Still loaded the revolver and kept it within reach. Around 10 o'clock I tried to sleep. I'd brought my sleeping bag, and the canvas cot was surprisingly comfortable once I'd brushed off the dust. But every time I closed my eyes I saw those photographs. Gregory's empty gaze, his naked, scarred body, his hands curled into fists. A man who'd been feral for over 20 years. A man who knew my father had been coming to this cabin. A man who might not understand that my father was dead, that I was someone different. Around midnight, I was still awake, staring at the ceiling and listening to the wind. And that's when I heard it. Footsteps. At first, I thought I was imagining it. The forest was full of sounds, after all, but these were unmistakable. The rhythmic impact of feet against earth, moving in a steady bipedal gait. Something was approaching the cabin. I sat up slowly, reaching for the flashlight and the revolver. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. The footsteps continued, getting closer, and I realized with growing dread that they were circling, moving around the cabin in a wide arc. Not approaching directly, but circling, studying. I moved to the window, keeping the flashlight off, and very carefully opened the shutter just a crack. The moon was nearly full, providing enough light to see the clearing in front of the cabin, the edge of the forest beyond. And there, moving through the shadows at the tree line, I saw him. Gregory. Even at a distance, even in the dim moonlight, I recognized him from the photographs. The wild red hair, pale skin visible through streaks of dirt, moving with an unnatural smoothness through the trees. He was naked despite the cold, seemingly unbothered by the November temperatures that had me shivering even inside the cabin. He continued his circular path, moving from tree to tree, sometimes pausing to stand completely still for 30 seconds or more before moving again. Each time he paused, he faced the cabin, watching it. I felt pinned by that attention, even though I knew he couldn't see me through the shuttered window. But the intensity of his focus was palpable. This wasn't casual curiosity. This was examination, assessment. He was trying to determine if I was my father. The circuit brought him closer with each rotation. The first pass had been perhaps 100 feet from the cabin. The second was closer to 70. The third brought him within 50 feet, close enough that I could see details I wished I couldn't. His body was indeed covered in scars. Long gouges that could have been from branches or animal claws. Round marks that might have been infected wounds. Burn scars on one arm that formed a pattern I couldn't interpret. His hair reached past his shoulders, matted and tangled. His beard was a wild tangle that merged with his chest hair. But it was his face that transfixed me. In the photographs, his expression had been vacant or confused. Now in person, it was completely unreadable. His features held no emotion I could name. His eyes reflected the moonlight but revealed nothing behind them. He looked like a man-shaped thing that had forgotten how to be human. The fourth circuit brought him to about 30 feet. Close enough that I could hear his breathing, steady, unhurried, almost meditative. He paused directly in front of the cabin, standing in the center of the clearing, and tilted his head as if listening. I held my breath, not daring to move. We stayed that way for what felt like an eternity. Him standing in the moonlight, me hiding behind the shutter, both of us frozen in a tableau of mutual awareness. Then, without warning, he began walking directly toward the cabin door. Not running, not charging, just walking with that same steady, purposeful gait. The footsteps were loud in the night silence, and I counted them reflexively. 20 steps, 15. He stopped directly outside the door. So close I could hear him breathing on the other side of the wood. "Hello?" I called out, my voice cracking. "I'm armed. I have a gun. Don't try to come in here." No response. Just breathing. "My name is Paul," I continued, trying to steady my voice.
Paul? Not the man you knew. He's gone. He's dead. Do you understand? He died. He won't be coming back.
The breathing continued, unchanged. "I'm his son," I said, though I had no idea if that meant anything to Gregory, if he even understood the concept of family anymore. "I'm just here to see what he was doing. I'm leaving in the morning. I won't bother you. I just want to see, and then I'll go." Still nothing. Then, very softly, I heard a sound I hadn't expected. A voice. Rough and cracked, like something that hadn't been used in years, but still recognizably human. "James." My father's name. "No," I said quickly. "Not James. Paul. His son. James is dead. He had a heart attack. He drowned. He's gone." Silence again. Then, "James." Louder this time. More insistent. "No," I repeated, louder now. "James is dead. I'm Paul. I'm not the person you're looking for. I'm leaving in the morning. I'm sorry about my father. I'm sorry about whatever happened to you, but I can't help you. I don't know how to help you." The breathing stopped. In the sudden silence, I became aware of other sounds. My own heartbeat, the creak of the cabin's boards, the distant rustle of wind in trees. Then came the knocking, soft at first, almost gentle, a rhythmic tapping against the thick wooden door. Tap, tap, tap. "Please stop," I said, moving away from the door toward the back corner of the cabin. "Please. I don't want to hurt you, but I will if I have to. I have a gun. Do you understand? I will use it to protect myself." The tapping continued, growing gradually louder. Still rhythmic. Still that same measured pace. Tap, tap. But the sound was wrong somehow. Too broad for knuckles. Too solid for a fist. I realized with creeping horror what he was doing. He was hitting the door with his head. The same thing my father had documented. Gregory's response to frustration, to confusion, to whatever emotions still flickered in whatever remained of his mind. "Stop," I said, my voice rising. "Stop it, you're hurting yourself." But the impacts continued, growing harder, more forceful. I could hear the solid thunk of skull meeting wood, again and again and again. "Theod, Theod, Theod. James is dead," I shouted. "He's dead. He drowned. He had a heart attack and fell into his pool and drowned. Nobody found him for 2 days. He's dead. He's been dead for 3 months." The impacts stopped abruptly. Silence rushed back in, thick and suffocating. I stood in the corner, the revolver raised, watching the door and waiting for, I didn't know what, for him to break through, for him to leave, for this nightmare to end. Then I heard my father's name again, but this time it wasn't a statement. It was a question. "James?" The way a lost child might call for a parent. Confused, frightened. "He's gone," I said, more gently this time. "I'm sorry. He's really gone. He tried to help you. For years he tried, but he's gone now. And I don't know how to do what he did. I don't know how to help you." Footsteps again, but different now. Retreating. I rushed to the window and opened the shutter just enough to see out. Gregory was walking away, back toward the tree line, his movements somehow different, less fluid, almost stumbling. The way a person walks when they're crying, though I couldn't see his face clearly enough to know for sure. He reached the trees and disappeared into their shadows. I waited, watching, listening, but he didn't emerge again. I checked my watch, 2:47 a.m. There was no way I was sleeping now. No way I could close my eyes with the memory of that voice. James, still echoing in my mind. I spent the rest of that night in the cabin's corner, the revolver in my lap, watching both the door and the window for any sign of Gregory's return. The night stretched out interminably. Every sound made me flinch. Every shadow at the edge of my flashlight beam looked like a naked figure watching from the darkness. Around 4 o'clock, I noticed something on the door that I'd missed earlier in my panic. In the lantern light, I could see dark stains on the wood where Gregory had been hitting it. At first, I thought it was old blood from previous encounters. But when I moved closer, I realized it was fresh. And it wasn't just blood. There was saliva, too. He'd been pressing his face against the door, his mouth, leaving behind a mixture of fluids that had dripped down the wood in thick rivulets. The smell, now that I was close enough to notice it, was awful. Organic decay mixed with something I couldn't identify. How long had he been out there, pressing himself against the door, calling my father's name? I backed away, feeling sick. The journals had documented Gregory's deterioration, but they hadn't prepared me for the reality of it. This wasn't a man who'd simply chosen to live off the grid. This was someone whose mind had shattered so completely that he'd forgotten everything about being human except for one name, one connection to a world he no longer belonged to. My father had spent 7 years trying to rebuild that connection, and I destroyed it in one night by telling Gregory the truth. James was dead. The one person who'd remembered Gregory, who'd cared about him, who'd witnessed him gone. I should have felt justified in my honesty. Gregory deserved to know the truth, but as I stood there in the pre-dawn darkness, staring at the blood and saliva on the door, I wondered if truth had been the kindest option. My father had lied to Gregory through a mission for 7 years, had let him believe that someone still cared, that he wasn't completely alone. Maybe that lie had been the only thing keeping Gregory tethered to some fragment of humanity, and I'd cut that tether. Around 5 o'clock, I heard a sound that made me grip the revolver tighter. Not footsteps this time, but something else. A low sound, rhythmic and mournful. It took me several seconds to identify it. Keening. Someone was crying out there in the forest. Not human crying. There were no sobs, no gasps for breath. Just this constant wavering wail that rose and fell like wind through a bottle. It went on for nearly half an hour before finally fading to silence. I sat there listening to that sound and felt something break inside me. Not fear this time, but grief. For Gregory, for my father, for the impossible situation both of them had created and lived in for 7 years. My father had been trying to save a man who couldn't be saved. Gregory had been trying to remain connected to a man who couldn't stay. Both of them had suffered because of it. Both of them had sacrificed everything. Family, careers, sanity for a relationship that could never work. Had my father known it was futile? The journals suggested he'd held on to hope, at least in the beginning. But those final entries, the ones from 1985, had a quality of resignation to them. Maybe I can't bring him back. Maybe that's not even what he wants. Maybe my father had realized toward the end that he wasn't trying to save Gregory at all. Maybe he'd just been bearing witness, proving that someone remembered who Gregory had been, even if Gregory himself had forgotten. First light began to seep through the cabin's window around 6:30. I'd never been so grateful to see dawn. As soon as there was enough light to navigate safely, I was leaving, hiking out, getting back to my car, driving away from this place and never returning. I began packing my things, moving quietly, still hyper-aware of every sound from outside. But the forest had grown still. No keening, no footsteps, no signs of Gregory at all. When I was ready to leave, I stood at the door for a long moment, trying to work up the courage to open it.
Oh, what if Gregory was right outside, waiting?
What if opening the door triggered another confrontation? But I couldn't stay here forever. I unlocked the door and pulled it open quickly, the revolver raised. Nothing. The clearing was empty. Morning mist clung to the ground, and the forest was quiet except for the gradual awakening of birds. No sign of Gregory anywhere. I stepped outside carefully, eyes scanning the tree line. The blood and saliva on the door looked even worse in daylight. Thick streaks that had dried to a dark brown. Flies already beginning to gather. I could see drops of blood on the ground too, leading away from the cabin in the direction Gregory had gone. He'd injured himself badly during that encounter. possibly severely, given how much blood there was. Part of me wanted to follow those drops, to make sure he was okay, to help him if he needed it. But a larger part, the part that valued my own safety and sanity, told me to leave immediately and call the authorities. I started walking, following my father's careful directions in reverse, west toward Happy Camp, away from whatever Gregory had become. But I couldn't stop thinking about him out there in the forest, bleeding, alone, now completely isolated in a way he hadn't been even during his years of solitude. At least before he'd had my father, someone who checked on him, brought him food occasionally, spoke to him as if he were still human. Now he had no one. I reached the stream where I'd stopped the previous day, and as I refilled my water bottle, I noticed something. More counting marks on the boulder, carved higher up than the others I'd seen. These were fresher, the stone beneath still slightly lighter where it had been scraped away. 5 new marks, one for each year since my father had stopped coming regularly. I realized Gregory had been counting the years since James's visits became sporadic, marking time in the only way he remembered how. Waiting. The sight of those marks made my eyes burn with unshed tears. Not for my father this time, but for Gregory. For a man who'd lost everything and then spent 23 years in the wilderness, clinging to the one human connection he still had, and now even that was gone. I wanted to carve something into that boulder, some message to Gregory, some acknowledgement that I'd seen him, that I understood. But what could I possibly say? How could I explain the situation in a way that a man who could barely speak anymore might comprehend? In the end, I did nothing. I just refilled my water and kept walking. The hike out was faster than the hike in had been. Fear and adrenaline gave me energy I hadn't had the day before, and I was practically running by the time I reached the old logging road. I made it back to Happy Camp by early afternoon, exhausted and shaking but alive. Bill was there at the rafting company, working on one of the boats. When he saw me emerge from the trail, he set down his tools and walked over. "You look like hell," he said bluntly. "I met him," I said, my voice hoarse. "Gregory. He came to the cabin last night." Bill's expression shifted from concern to something more guarded. "He hurt you?" "No. But he..." I stopped, trying to find words for what had happened. "He was looking for my father. He doesn't understand that Dad's dead." "You tell him?" I tried. "I don't think..." I swallowed hard. "I don't think he can really understand anymore. Words don't work the same way for him now." Bill nodded slowly, like this wasn't surprising. "Your daddy spent a lot of years trying to talk to him. Don't beat yourself up if you couldn't do in one night what James couldn't do in 7 years." "I need to report this," I said. "Call the Rangers. Tell them what happened. He injured himself last night. I saw blood. He might need medical attention." "Paul." Bill's voice was gentle but firm. "Rangers know about Gregory. They've known for over 20 years. They've tried to help him 6 times. He won't let them. Runs deeper into the woods every time they get close. Eventually, they decided the kindest thing was to leave him be. But he's hurt. He's been hurt plenty of times before. Always heals up. He's survived 23 years in those mountains, through winters and summers, injuries and illness. He's tougher than you think. Or he's suffering, and no one cares enough to help him." Bill was quiet for a moment. "Then your daddy cared. Maybe cared too much, and look where it got him." The words stung because they were true. My father had destroyed his life trying to save Gregory, had abandoned his family, his career, his health. And for what? Gregory was still out there, still alone, still lost. My father's sacrifice had accomplished nothing except his own destruction. "I'm calling anyway," I said. "They should at least know what happened." Bill shrugged. "Suit yourself. Ranger Station's number is on the board inside." I made the call from Bill's office, speaking to a ranger named Tom who listened to my account with the patient tone of someone who'd heard similar stories many times before. "We appreciate you reporting this, Mr. Walsh," he said when I finished. "We do make periodic checks on Mr. Walsh. Gregory Walsh, I mean, no relation to you when we can. But our ability to help him is limited by his cooperation, and he doesn't cooperate. He's living like an animal," I protested. "He can barely speak. He was injured last night because of me, because I upset him. Someone needs to do something." "Sir, I understand your concern, but Gregory Walsh is an adult, and he's not breaking any laws. He's chosen to live in the wilderness, and while we don't approve of or recommend that choice, we can't force him to accept help he doesn't want. He doesn't know what he wants. He's not capable of making that decision anymore." Then we'd need a psychiatric evaluation to determine competency, which would require bringing him in against his will, which we can't legally do without evidence that he's a danger to himself or others. It's a catch-22, Mr. Walsh. Trust me, we've been down this road before. I wanted to argue further, but I could hear in the ranger's voice that it would be pointless. The system couldn't help Gregory, because Gregory couldn't or wouldn't engage with the system, and my father, who'd tried to bridge that gap, was dead. After I hung up, I sat in Bill's office for a while, staring at nothing. Finally, Bill brought me a cup of coffee and sat down across from me. "You want to know what I think?" he asked. "Sure. I think Gregory's been dying for 23 years. Maybe that accident killed his family instantly, but it's been killing him slow. Every day he stays up there, he's a little less human. Maybe another 5 years, maybe 10, he'll forget even the little bit he still remembers. And then eventually he'll die, probably in his sleep if he's lucky, and that'll be the end of it. That's horrible." "Yeah, it is. But it's also his choice, in whatever way he's still capable of making choices. Your daddy understood that, eventually. That's why those last journal entries sounded the way they did. He wasn't trying to save Gregory anymore. He was just keeping him company while he died. The image that created in my mind, my father sitting in that cabin, knowing Gregory was out there somewhere, dying by inches, and choosing to bear witness to that slow death was almost too painful to contemplate. But it also explained everything. The obsession, the sacrifice, the years of dedication to an impossible task. My father hadn't been crazy. He'd been performing an act of compassion that had required giving up everything else he valued. "I need to go home," I said finally. Bill nodded. "Probably for the best. I'm putting the cabin up for sale. I don't want it." "Can't say I blame you, but..." Bill hesitated. "Maybe think about it a bit more first. That cabin's the only connection Gregory still has to the world. Your daddy built it for him, in a way. A place where someone cared about him, remembered him. You sell it to strangers, they might tear it down or change it. And then Gregory won't even have that." I wanted to argue that Gregory didn't need a cabin, that he barely seemed aware of his surroundings beyond the most basic level. But I remembered those counting marks on the boulder, the way Gregory had come to the cabin looking for my father, the sound of his keening in the woods. He knew. Maybe not in a way I could fully understand, but he knew that the cabin mattered, that James had mattered. "I'll think about it," I said, though I wasn't sure I would. I drove home in a fog of exhaustion and confusion, my mind replaying the events of the previous night over and over. Gregory's voice calling my father's name, the sound of his head hitting the door, the keening that had lasted half an hour. By the time I reached Portland, I'd made a decision. I was selling the cabin. I couldn't maintain it the way my father had, and I couldn't bear the thought of returning to that place, of potentially encountering Gregory again. The best thing for everyone was to cut ties completely and let Gregory live out whatever remained of his life without interference. When I told my mother about the trip, I edited heavily. I told her about the journals, about Gregory, about my father's obsession, but I left out the encounter, the blood on the door, the keening in the woods. She didn't need those nightmares. "Your father was a fool," she said when I finished, wasting his life on a stranger while his own family fell apart. "Maybe," I agreed, "but I think he was trying to do something good. The road to hell is paved with good intentions," she said bitterly. She wasn't wrong. I listed the cabin and land for sale in December of 1985, priced low enough that I hoped someone would take it quickly. But winter turned to spring, and spring to summer without any serious offers. The location was too remote, the structure too deteriorated, the whole setup too strange for most buyers. Meanwhile, I couldn't stop thinking about Gregory. I'd wake up some nights hearing that keening sound in my memory, or remembering the way he'd said my father's name like a question. "James." I called the ranger station twice more over that winter, asking if anyone had seen Gregory, if he was okay. Both times I got variations of the same response. They couldn't provide updates on specific individuals, but they had no reports of anyone finding a body in the mountains, so presumably he was still alive. Presumably. In March of 1986, something strange happened. I received a letter forwarded from my father's attorney. It had no return address, and had been mailed from Happy Camp. Inside was a single photograph. It showed Gregory, taken from a distance, sitting beside a stream. The image quality was poor, clearly shot with an old camera or in bad light, but I could make out his distinctive red hair, his naked form, his hunched posture. But what caught my attention was what he was holding. In his hands, positioned carefully in his lap, was a piece of clothing, a shirt. And even in the grainy photograph, I could tell it was one of my father's shirts, the blue plaid flannel he'd worn constantly, the one my mother had complained about because he refused to replace it even after it got holes in the elbows. Gregory was holding it like it was precious, like it was a connection to something important that he couldn't quite remember but refused to let go of. There was nothing else in the envelope. No note, no explanation. Just that one photograph. I never found out who sent it. Maybe Bill. Maybe another hiker who'd seen Gregory. Maybe even a ranger who understood what my father had been trying to do. But whoever had taken that picture had done so because they thought I needed to see it. And they were right. Looking at Gregory holding my father's shirt, I finally understood. This wasn't about salvation or rescue or fixing what was broken. My father had known, probably years before his death, that Gregory couldn't be saved, that the man who'd gone into those mountains in 1963 was gone forever, and what remained was something else, not quite animal, not quite human, just a living ghost of who Gregory had been. But my father had stayed anyway, had kept visiting, kept watching, kept caring, because someone needed to remember Gregory, even if Gregory couldn't remember himself. That was my father's sacrifice, not trying to save Gregory, but choosing to witness him, to be the one person in the world who still saw Gregory Walsh, instead of just a naked wild man in the woods. I took the cabin off the market the next day. I couldn't maintain it the way my father had. Couldn't make the trips multiple times a year. Couldn't dedicate my life to watching over a stranger. But I could keep it standing. Could pay the property taxes each year. Could ensure that the one physical structure that connected Gregory to his past remained there for as long as he needed it. It's been 3 years now since my father died. Since I made that trip to the cabin, I've never gone back. I'm not sure I ever will. But I still own the land, still pay those taxes, still think about Gregory sometimes when I can't sleep. Is he still alive? I don't know. The rangers stopped providing even vague updates. And I stopped asking. Maybe he died that winter after I saw him. Maybe he'll live another 20 years. There's no way to know without going back. And I can't bring myself to do that. But sometimes, late at night, I imagine him sitting beside that stream, holding my father's shirt, counting marks on a boulder, waiting for someone who will never return. And I hope, maybe foolishly, maybe naively, that some small part of him understands that someone still remembers, that he's not completely forgotten. My father spent 7 years trying to prove that to Gregory. The least I can do is maintain that proof for whatever time remains. People sometimes ask me about the cabin, about why I keep a property I never use in a location I never visit. I give them simplified answers about sentimental value, about inheritance, about not having time to deal with selling it. But the real answer is more complicated. I keep it because letting it go would mean accepting that my father's sacrifice was meaningless. That 7 years of dedication, of watching, of caring for someone who couldn't care for himself, had accomplished nothing. And I can't accept that. I won't. Gregory Walsh lost his family in 1962, and lost himself shortly after. He's been living as a ghost for over 25 years now. But he's not alone. Not completely. Because somewhere in Portland, a man named Paul Walsh pays property taxes on a cabin his father built. And in that cabin, if no one has stolen them, are journals and photographs and maps that prove someone once cared about Gregory Walsh enough to sacrifice everything. That has to mean something. It has to. I choose to believe it does. And on the nights when I can't sleep, when I remember the blood on the door and the keening in the woods and the way Gregory called my father's name, I tell myself that maybe, just maybe, Gregory believes it too, even if he can't remember why. I always knew Snowshoe Gulch carried a darkness that went deeper than shadows. Most trails winding through Flathead National Forest do, especially if you spend enough time listening to the locals who've devoted their lives to hunting, fishing, and guiding tourists through these unforgiving mountains. Growing up in this remote corner of Montana, I'd heard the whispers countless times, quiet warnings about places where the air felt wrong, where even the most experienced outdoorsmen turned back without explanation. My brother Eli and I used to joke about those stories sometimes, dismissing them as campfire entertainment or the paranoid ramblings of old-timers who'd spent too many winters alone in the wilderness. But neither of us ever laughed too loudly about it, and we always kept one eye on the tree line when dusk began settling over the ridges. When Eli disappeared with his client Eric Halstead in the bitter cold of early January 2021, Those whispers returned with a vengeance, louder and colder than before. 3 agonizing days after they failed to return from what should have been a routine winter guiding expedition, Flathead County Search and Rescue mobilized, combing the trails with dogs and volunteers, desperately trying to pick up any trace of their tracks. The sheriff's department asked me to join the main search party, but I declined. Instead, I assembled my own small team, Nathan Two Feathers, a Blackfeet tracker I'd known since childhood, whose instincts in these mountains bordered on supernatural. Deputy Greg Weller from the county sheriff's department, a decent man but skeptical of anything he couldn't explain with logic, and Jesse Pruitt, a local mechanic who'd been riding snowmobiles through these forests since before I was born. We departed before sunrise on the 4th morning, our engines cutting violently through the pre-dawn silence, headlights carving narrow tunnels through the heavy snow flurries rolling down from the peaks. The temperature hovered around -15 degrees, cold enough that exposed skin would freeze in minutes. It took nearly 3 hours of hard riding before we finally reached the southern edge of Snowshoe Gulch, a place I'd avoided my entire life without ever really understanding why. The gulch wasn't designed for snowmobiling, too steep, too narrow, and notorious for sudden weather changes that could trap the unprepared. But Eli's GPS tracker had pinged near this location before going completely silent, and that was the only lead we had. Nathan slowed his snowmobile ahead of me, raising one gloved hand to signal a stop. His expression beneath the fur-lined hood of his parka was grave, his dark eyes scanning the dense forest with obvious unease. I pulled up alongside him, killing my engine, the sudden silence almost painful after hours of mechanical noise. "This place feels wrong," Nathan said quietly, his breath forming thick clouds in the frozen air. He stared into the trees, his jaw tight. "My grandfather refused to hunt anywhere near here. He called it a place the forest wouldn't reclaim, a place where the old rules didn't apply." Greg chuckled nervously behind us, clearly trying to inject some levity into the oppressive atmosphere. "Come on, Two Feathers. Let's not start spooking ourselves before we even begin searching." Nathan didn't acknowledge him, keeping his eyes fixed on me instead. "Caleb, if your brother came here willingly, he had a damn good reason. Eli was careful, experienced. He wouldn't enter this gulch without cause." I nodded silently, unable to argue with that assessment. Eli had spent 15 years guiding hunters and tourists through these mountains. He knew every trail, every dangerous crossing, every place where the weather could turn deadly without warning. If he'd brought a client into Snowshoe Gulch, something significant had drawn him here. We rode slowly into the mouth of the gulch, engines growling as we navigated around fallen timber and snowdrifts that towered higher than our heads in places. The deeper we penetrated into this narrow valley, the more the world seemed to close in around us. The familiar sounds of the forest, the distant call of ravens, the whisper of wind through pine branches, the occasional crack of ice-laden limbs, all of it gradually faded away until we rode through a silence so complete it felt unnatural, suffocating. Jesse spotted the abandoned snowmobiles first, pointing wordlessly toward a small clearing about 50 yards ahead. I felt my stomach drop as we approached. 2 machines sat in the deep snow, arranged nose to nose in a perfect circle, their headlights still faintly glowing beneath accumulated drifts. The positioning was deliberate, geometric, completely inexplicable. "Why would anyone park like that?" Jesse whispered, his voice tight with growing unease. I dismounted and approached Eli's machine, brushing away the snow that had accumulated on the seat and controls. His keys dangled from the ignition, swaying slightly in the cold breeze. The fuel gauge registered half full. The emergency kit he always carried remained strapped to the back. Nothing about this made any sense. Eli was methodical to the point of obsession about equipment and safety. He would never abandon his snowmobile in this condition, arranged in such a bizarre formation, without an overwhelming reason. Nathan crouched near the machines, examining the ground with the focused intensity I'd seen countless times before. 2 sets of footprints, he announced, his voice carefully neutral. Boot patterns match what Eli and Eric would have been wearing. But look at the stride, the depth, the spacing. They weren't running, weren't panicked. They walked away from here deliberately, calmly. We followed the tracks carefully through the snow, moving in single file, each of us scanning the surrounding forest. The prints led us approximately 200 yards through the trees before ending abruptly at the edge of a frozen creek. The transition was absolute clear boot impressions in the snow one moment, nothing but unmarked ice the next. Greg stepped cautiously onto the frozen surface, testing its stability before kneeling to shine his flashlight through the crystalline layers. Solid ice at least 8 inches thick. No cracks, no signs of anyone breaking through or falling in. "That's impossible," Jesse muttered, circling the area where the tracks vanished. Tracks don't just disappear into thin air. There has to be an explanation. Nathan stood motionless at the creek's edge, his gaze slowly traveling upward to study the heavy branches overhanging the frozen water. His expression had gone blank, unreadable. Something erased them, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. This place doesn't belong to us. It never did. The sun began its rapid descent behind the western ridgeline, bringing the swift darkness that winter imposes on these mountains. We established camp on a relatively flat rise overlooking the clearing where we discovered the abandoned snowmobiles, building a fire that crackled and popped against the suffocating stillness of the surrounding forest. The flames provided warmth but offered little comfort against the oppressive atmosphere pressing down on us from all sides. Nathan moved around the perimeter of our camp in silence, pausing at the 4 cardinal directions to scatter pinches of tobacco from a leather pouch he carried. Greg watched this ritual with obvious skepticism, his mouth working as if forming questions he couldn't quite bring himself to ask. Jesse paced restlessly near the fire, constantly glancing toward the darkening shadows between the trees, jumping at every small sound. After the others had retreated to their sleeping bags, I remained awake, sitting on a log near the fire, staring into the impenetrable darkness beyond our small circle of light. Somewhere out in those woods was my brother. I couldn't shake the overwhelming sensation that something unseen was watching our camp, observing us with patient malevolence. The feeling was so strong it made my skin crawl, raised the hair on my arms despite the layers of clothing I wore. I glanced at Nathan. He hadn't moved from his position by the fire, sitting cross-legged, completely still except for his eyes, which continuously scanned the tree line. I moved closer to him, keeping my voice low. What did your grandfather actually say lived out here? Nathan remained silent for a long moment, his face illuminated by the flickering firelight, shadows dancing across his weathered features. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. He called it the Eater of Men. Something old, something hungry, something that existed in these mountains long before any tribe claimed this territory. He said it sleeps for years, sometimes decades, until someone wakes it. And once awoken, it doesn't stop until it's fed. A shiver ran through me that had nothing to do with the temperature. Before I could respond, Jesse suddenly jerked awake from where he'd been dozing near the fire, his eyes wide with terror, his breath coming in sharp gasps. He scrambled backward awkwardly, nearly falling, pointing frantically toward the trees directly behind where I sat. I saw someone, Jesse gasped, his voice cracking. I saw someone tall, impossibly tall, walking just beyond the trees, just standing there, watching us. We grabbed flashlights and weapons immediately, scanning the darkness beyond the reach of our fire's glow. I swept my light back and forth methodically, illuminating nothing but endless ranks of snow-covered pines and the skeletal remains of dead aspens. No movement, no tracks, no sign that anything living had been there. You imagined it, Greg said, but his voice lacked conviction. He gripped his rifle tightly, his eyes darting nervously between the trees. Jesse shook his head violently, retreating closer to the fire, his hands trembling. I know what I saw. It was tall, taller than any man, and it moved wrong, like its joints bent in places they shouldn't. Nathan watched silently, his jaw clenched tight, every muscle in his body tense. Then he turned slowly back toward the fire, feeding another log into the flames. Try to sleep if you can. Tomorrow will be harder than today. I lay in my sleeping bag for hours, eyes open, staring up at the canopy of branches overhead, watching my breath form clouds in the frigid air. Every small sound, the crack of a branch, the shift of snow sliding from a limb, the distant creak of trees swaying made my heart race. Each shadow seemed to transform into something standing there at the edge of the firelight, observing us with inhuman patience. I lay awake through most of the night, waiting for dawn, knowing in my gut that whatever inhabited this place was out there in the darkness, watching, waiting, circling our fragile camp like a predator assessing prey. Morning arrived gray and bitter, a thick mist clinging to Snowshoe Gulch like a funeral shroud, reducing visibility to barely 50 feet in any direction. I'd managed perhaps 2 hours of restless, nightmare-filled sleep before giving up entirely. When I emerged from my sleeping bag, stiff and exhausted, Nathan was already awake, methodically packing gear with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd spent a lifetime in the wilderness. Greg stood nearby, pacing impatiently, constantly checking his watch and glancing toward the silent trees. Jesse sat hunched close to the dying embers of our fire, staring blankly into the snow, his face pale and drawn. I pulled my coat tighter against the biting wind, trying to ignore the knot of dread that had taken up permanent residence in my stomach. We ate a quick breakfast of energy bars and instant coffee, our conversation limited to discussing the plan for the day. Nathan stood, shouldered his pack, and spoke quietly but firmly. We follow the tracks as far as they lead, then we reassess the situation. Everyone stays within visual contact at all times. Nobody goes off alone for any reason. Understood? We all nodded. Though I could see the doubt in Greg's eyes, the fear in Jesse's face. We retraced our route from the previous day, returning to the frozen creek where Eli and Eric's footprints had vanished. The tracks remained exactly as we'd left them, ending abruptly at the ice's edge, as inexplicable in daylight as they'd been at dusk. Nathan knelt again, brushing away fresh snow with his gloved hand, examining the ground with intense concentration. This wasn't natural, he muttered, barely loud enough for me to hear. Something covered their trail deliberately. Greg cleared his throat impatiently, obviously eager to dismiss Nathan's interpretation. Then let's find what did it and be done with this. We're burning daylight standing here. Nathan said nothing, rising slowly to his feet, his eyes scanning the steep ridge that loomed above the creek. With no clear trail to follow, we began climbing the incline ahead, picking our way carefully through tangled brush and dense stands of lodgepole pine. Snow crunched loudly beneath our boots, the sound echoing oddly through the mist-shrouded woods. The farther we climbed, the more oppressive the silence became, pressing down around us like something physical, suffocating. We were perhaps halfway up the ridge when Jesse stopped abruptly, his voice trembling as he pointed upward. What the hell is that? We all turned, following his gesture. About 20 feet above us, wedged firmly into the trunk of a massive pine tree, was a deer skull. But not just placed there, embedded deeply into the bark, as if it had been driven into the wood with tremendous force. The skull had been picked completely clean, gleaming white in the gray light, its empty eye sockets staring down at us with hollow accusation. The jaw hung at an unnatural angle, creating an expression that looked almost like a scream. I felt bile rise in my throat, burning acidic against the back of my tongue. Who could do that? Jesse whispered, his voice barely audible. Greg stepped forward, tilting his head to examine the grotesque display more carefully, his face a mixture of disgust and confusion. No blood anywhere, no drag marks, no sign of how it got up there. This doesn't make any sense at all. Nathan wasn't looking at the skull anymore. His attention had shifted to the surrounding trees, his eyes wide and alert, his breathing shallow and rapid. He raised one hand, motioning urgently for silence, then pointed toward something farther up the slope. We moved cautiously forward, weapons ready, eyes scanning through the mist and shadows. What we found made my blood turn cold in my veins. Scattered through the trees ahead, arranged deliberately at heights ranging from 15 to 30 feet above the ground, were animal remains. Dozens of them. Antlers, deer legs, entire rib cages, the skull of what might have been an elk, all wedged between branches, positioned with obvious intention. Everything had been stripped of meat and picked completely clean, leaving only bone that gleamed unnaturally white against the dark bark. The remains looked desiccated, almost mummified, as if they'd been exposed to desert sun rather than mountain winter. I glanced at Nathan, whose face had gone visibly pale. His jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscles working beneath the skin. He shook his head slowly, his voice tight with barely controlled fear. This is a warning. A territorial marker. Whatever lives here wants us gone. Greg snorted, but the sound came out strangled, lacking his earlier skepticism. This is just some sick person playing twisted games, trying to scare people away. Nathan met his eyes without blinking, his expression absolutely certain. No person did this. No person could. Silence hung heavy between us, broken only by the whisper of wind through the branches above. Finally, Nathan spoke again, his voice firm but quiet with finality. I will not go any farther into this place. Whatever was awakened here is older than our understanding, more dangerous than you comprehend. We have intruded far enough. I stared at him, anger and fear warring for dominance inside me, my hands clenching into fists. My brother is still out here somewhere, Nathan. I'm not leaving until we find him, alive or dead. Nathan's eyes softened briefly, genuine sympathy crossing his features. I understand, Caleb, but I won't risk all of our lives for this. Not anymore. Greg set his jaw stubbornly, gripping his rifle tighter.
Then stay here and wait. Caleb and I will finish what we came to do.
I nodded, though my pulse pounded so loudly in my ears I could barely hear my own thoughts. Jesse looked back and forth between us uncertainly. then took a small step toward Nathan, avoiding my gaze entirely. "I'll stay too," he said quietly, shame evident in his voice. "I can't go up there. I just can't." Without another word, Greg and I continued upward into the mist. The air seemed to grow colder with each step, biting through every layer of clothing, seeping into my bones. My fingers tightened painfully on the handle of my flashlight, knuckles aching from the desperate grip. Behind us, I could hear Nathan's voice, low and rhythmic, speaking words in Blackfeet that I couldn't understand but somehow found oddly comforting. After what felt like an eternity of exhausting climbing, we finally crested the ridge. Greg stopped suddenly, his eyes going wide, all color draining from his face in an instant. "Caleb," he whispered hoarsely. "Oh God, Caleb." I followed his gaze and felt the world tilt sickeningly beneath my feet. Ahead of us, barely visible beneath a shallow covering of snow, was a dark shape, an arm, a sleeve, bright orange, unmistakable. Eric Halstead's parka. My heart seized painfully in my chest as we scrambled forward, falling to our knees, frantically digging through the snow with our hands. Eric's frozen face emerged gradually, rigid and twisted into an expression of absolute terror that no death should wear. His body had curled into a tight fetal position, every muscle locked in final spasm. Both of his feet were bare, exposed to the elements, blackened with severe frostbite. His eyes stared sightlessly upward at the gray sky, wide open, filled with a horror that seemed to persist even in death. "Jesus Christ," Greg breathed, stumbling backward, nearly falling in his haste to put distance between himself and the corpse. I knelt there in the snow, unable to tear my gaze away from Eric's face, from that expression of pure dread permanently etched into his frozen features. What had this man seen in his final moments? What had driven him to tear off his boots and curl into that defensive position before the cold claimed him? A sudden sharp crack echoed through the trees behind us, the sound of a branch breaking under significant weight. We both spun around instantly, Greg raising his rifle, his flashlight beam cutting wildly through the thickening mist. The forest appeared empty, nothing but endless ranks of silent trees disappearing into the gray. Yet I could feel something there, something massive and patient, watching us with ancient hunger. The sensation was so overwhelming, so undeniable, that every instinct I possessed screamed at me to run, to flee this place and never return. The hair stood up on the back of my neck as silence reclaimed the forest, broken only by our ragged breathing and the hammering of my heart. "Let's get him back to camp," I finally managed to whisper, my voice shaking despite my efforts to control it. We lifted Eric's rigid body awkwardly between us, his limbs locked in their final position, making him difficult to carry. Our breath misted the air in hurried bursts as we began the descent, every step feeling heavier than the last, as if the mountain itself was trying to hold us back. The weight of unseen eyes followed our progress, never wavering, never blinking. Nathan and Jesse met us halfway down the ridge, their expressions going grim when they saw what we carried. Nathan's eyes never left Eric's contorted face, his jaw working silently as if he was praying, or perhaps cursing. When we finally reached flatter ground, Nathan spoke quietly but with absolute conviction. "Leave him here. Don't bring the marked one back to our fire." Greg bristled immediately, exhaustion and fear making him aggressive. "Like hell we will. We're not leaving a body out here for animals." Nathan didn't flinch, didn't move, his eyes hard as stone. "That body is marked. It carries the scent. If you bring it to our fire, you invite what hunts these woods directly to us." Greg cursed bitterly, but I raised a hand to silence the argument before it could escalate. "We'll bury him nearby then," I said quietly, ignoring the nausea churning in my stomach. "We'll do it properly." We found a sheltered spot beneath a rock overhang about 50 yards from our main camp. The ground was partially frozen, making the digging brutal, exhausting work. We used our hands, knives, anything we could employ to scrape out a shallow grave in the unforgiving earth. We placed Eric's body carefully into the depression, trying to afford him some dignity even in this horrible place. As we covered him with frozen earth and snow, marking the spot with a simple cross made from branches, Nathan stood at a distance, watching the darkening woods with unwavering attention, his lips moving constantly in what might have been prayer, or might have been warning spoken to whatever listened in these mountains. That night around our rebuilt fire, we barely spoke to each other. The silence felt safer somehow, as if words might attract unwanted attention. Greg sat rigid and alert, staring angrily into the surrounding darkness, his rifle across his lap, finger never far from the trigger. Jesse had curled up as close to the flames as he could manage without burning himself, his eyes wide with terror, flinching violently at every small sound. The pop of the fire, the creak of a branch, the shift of snow. Nathan remained in his position at the camp's edge, his back to the fire, gaze fixed unwaveringly on the tree line. I tried to eat something, forcing down bites of dried meat that tasted like ash in my mouth, washing it down with water so cold it made my teeth ache. As exhaustion finally began pulling at my consciousness despite my fear, I heard it. The sound started so quietly I thought I might be imagining it. A slow, heavy crunching through the snow, methodical and deliberate. It circled our camp just beyond the reach of the firelight, moving steadily from east to south to west to north, then beginning the circuit again. Each footfall was distinct, purposeful, patient. Whatever created those sounds was in no hurry. It had all night. I lifted my head slowly, scanning the darkness, my heart racing. Nothing moved in the shadows between the trees. Yet the crunching continued, maintaining a constant distance from our fire, never quite seen but always present, always circling. I glanced at Nathan and realized he'd heard it too. His entire body had gone rigid, every muscle tensed. His hand rested on the knife at his belt, knuckles white from the grip. He didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge me, simply continued staring into the darkness with an expression I'd never seen on his face before. Primal, instinctive fear. Greg stood suddenly, raising his rifle toward the sound. "Show yourself," he shouted, his voice cracking slightly. "We're armed. We will defend ourselves." His words echoed briefly through the forest before being swallowed by the oppressive silence. For a moment, the crunching stopped entirely. Then it resumed, continuing its patient circle, perhaps moving slightly closer, though I couldn't be certain. "Don't challenge it," Nathan whispered urgently. "Don't acknowledge it directly." "What the hell is out there?" Jesse whimpered, his voice high with barely controlled panic. Nathan didn't answer, didn't move, simply continued his vigil as the unseen presence circled endlessly through the night. I tried to track its movement by sound alone, turning slowly to follow the footsteps, but I could never pinpoint an exact location. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously, echoing oddly through the trees. Hours passed with agonizing slowness. The fire burned lower despite our efforts to feed it. The circling continued without pause, without variation, maintaining its patient orbit around our fragile camp. Twice more Greg stood and shouted challenges into the darkness. Twice more his words vanished unanswered into the void. As sleep finally claimed me despite my terror, pulling me down into restless unconsciousness, one thought echoed relentlessly through my fading awareness. We were never alone out here. We had never been alone from the moment we entered Snowshoe Gulch, and whatever watched us from the darkness was growing tired of simply watching. I woke to another ashen dawn, frost coating everything with a thick layer of crystallized moisture that glittered in the weak morning light. The fire had burned down to nothing but cold embers. My entire body ached from tension and poor sleep, muscles sore as if I'd spent the night fighting rather than lying in a sleeping bag. I sat up stiffly, my breath forming thick clouds, and scanned the campsite. Nathan was already awake, methodically sharpening his knife with a whetstone, the rhythmic scraping sound oddly comforting in the oppressive silence. His eyes looked hollow, exhausted, the eyes of someone who hadn't slept at all. Across the dead fire, Jesse sat hugging his knees, rocking slightly, muttering under his breath. Greg was checking his rifle with jerky, anxious movements, his jaw clenched so tight I thought his teeth might crack. Nathan finally spoke, his voice rough from disuse, eyes meeting mine briefly before returning to his blade. "We need to leave this place, now. There's nothing left here we can save." "My brother is still out here, Nathan," I said, my voice harder than I intended. "I won't abandon him, I can't." Nathan sighed heavily, setting down his knife and whetstone with deliberate care. He stood slowly, his movements those of someone much older than his years, and met my eyes with an intensity that made me want to look away. "Caleb, listen to me carefully. Your brother isn't here anymore. Not the way you remember him. This place doesn't return what it takes. It changes things, corrupts them, uses them." Greg interrupted sharply, stepping forward aggressively. "Enough with this superstitious nonsense. We found Eric's body. That proves people can survive here, at least for a time. There's still a real chance Eli is alive somewhere in these woods." Nathan's eyes darkened, his expression becoming something close to pity. "What's alive in these woods isn't your brother anymore." The certainty in his voice made something cold settle in my chest, but I pushed it away, clinging to hope because the alternative was unbearable. Greg touched my shoulder, his voice firm and reassuring despite the fear I could see in his eyes. We came here to find him. Let's finish what we started. I nodded slowly, pushing away Nathan's warning, and adjusted my pack with numb fingers. Jesse shook his head frantically, backing toward Nathan like a child seeking protection. I'm staying here. I can't go back up there. I can't. Nathan placed a reassuring hand on Jesse's trembling shoulder, watching as Greg and I prepared to leave. As we moved into the trees, beginning the climb back toward the ridge, Nathan called after us softly, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. If you see it, don't run. Running triggers the chase. And whatever you do, don't look it directly in the eyes. Don't give it that connection. The climb back to the ridge was brutal. Every step an effort. The weight of our gear and our growing dread making the ascent feel endless. Silence stretched between Greg and me, broken only by our labored breathing and the crunch of snow beneath our boots. Greg led with his rifle clenched in white-knuckled hands, constantly scanning the trees, jumping at every shadow. As we crested the ridge, we both froze simultaneously, our breaths catching in our throats. The forest had changed overnight. Branches had been broken systematically, arranged in a crude circle perhaps 30 feet in diameter, each limb twisted and positioned with obvious intent. The pattern was intricate, deliberate, unmistakably purposeful, and leading into this circle, clearly visible in the fresh snow, were boot prints. Eli's distinctive tread pattern, the same boots he'd been wearing when he disappeared. My pulse quickened painfully, hope and dread tangling together until I couldn't separate them. Greg stepped forward cautiously, kneeling to examine the tracks more closely. These are fresh, he said quietly, his voice filled with confusion. These were made within the last few hours. How is that possible? We followed the tracks slowly, every sense heightened, scanning the shadows between the trees for any sign of movement. The prints wound deeper into the forest, weaving between massive pines, until they disappeared behind a dense wall of tangled undergrowth and fallen timber. Then, from just beyond those trees came a voice. Thin, hollow, but unmistakable, Eli's voice. "Caleb, is that you? I've been waiting. I knew you'd come." I broke forward without thinking, all caution abandoned, desperation propelling me past Greg. He called out sharply behind me, but I didn't slow down. Couldn't slow down. I pushed through the dense branches, ignoring the way they tore at my clothes and skin, and emerged into a small clearing. Eli stood at the far end, perhaps 30 yards away, barefoot in the deep snow. His parka hung torn and filthy from his shoulders, exposing skin that had gone pale blue beneath. He trembled violently, continuously, but his face remained eerily calm, eyes glazed and unfocused, staring through me rather than at me. His lips were cracked and bleeding, his beard crusted with ice. "Eli," I gasped, my voice breaking. "Oh God, Eli, we're here. We found you." He didn't move, didn't acknowledge my words in any way. Instead, his eyes slowly widened, focused on something beyond me, behind me. Terror flooded his features, transforming his face into a mask of absolute horror. A sound erupted from the trees at my back. Not quite a roar, not quite a scream. Something that seemed to exist between those categories, resonating at a frequency that made my bones vibrate and my vision blur. The sound was wrong, fundamentally wrong. The vocalization of something that had no right to exist in this world. Greg spun around behind me, rifle raised, shouting incoherently. I grabbed Eli's arm, or tried to. He jerked away from my touch as if burned, his eyes wild and unseeing. "Run," Greg shouted, firing blindly into the trees. The shots echoed like thunder, swallowed almost immediately by the forest. "Run now!" I grabbed Eli again, this time managing to get a grip on his torn parka, and pulled him forward, stumbling through the snow, my heart hammering so violently I thought it might burst. Behind me I heard Greg scream, a raw, agonized sound that cut off abruptly, replaced by something wet and terrible that I refused to process, refused to comprehend. I didn't turn back, couldn't turn back. We burst through the trees, slipping and falling down the slope toward where Nathan and Jesse waited. Eli moved mechanically, his feet bleeding, leaving a trail of red in the white snow, but he kept moving, driven by whatever remained of his survival instinct. Nathan rushed to meet us halfway, his eyes wide with urgency and fear. "Keep moving," he shouted, gripping Eli's other arm, pulling us both forward with surprising strength. "Don't stop! Don't look back!" Behind us I could hear it, branches snapping violently, trees creaking as something massive moved through the forest. Not running, not hurrying, just following with patient certainty. The sound was methodical, relentless, the pace of something that knew its prey couldn't escape, that had all the time in the world. My lungs burned as we scrambled down to where the snowmobiles waited. Jesse had already started the engines. The mechanical roar, a beautiful civilized sound in this nightmare. Nathan shoved Eli onto the sled behind Jesse, then turned sharply toward the tree line, his knife drawn, his lips moving rapidly in what I recognize now as prayer. He pushed me toward my snowmobile, his eyes fierce and clear despite the fear I could see beneath. "Go," he commanded. "Get him out of here. Go now." The engines roared to full throttle, drowning out everything. The forest sounds, my protests, the approaching presence behind us. I hesitated for just a second, looking back at Nathan standing alone between us and whatever hunted these woods. He stood facing the trees defiantly, knife raised, chanting words I couldn't hear, his back straight and proud. Then we were speeding away, the gulch disappearing behind us in a blur of white and shadow and terror. We rode hard, engines screaming, not slowing until we'd reached open ground near the main trails miles away. Only then did Jesse finally kill the engine, both of us too exhausted and traumatized to continue. I slid off my snowmobile, legs shaking so badly I nearly collapsed. I turned to check on Eli. He sat motionless on the back of Jesse's sled, his bleeding feet dangling, his eyes distant and unfocused, staring at nothing. His lips moved constantly, forming words too quiet to hear. Jesse stood several feet back, breathing heavily, his face pale and wet with tears. He probably didn't realize he was crying. In the sudden silence, broken only by our ragged breathing and the ticking of cooling engines, Eli's whispers finally became clear enough to understand. "It watches through the bones," he murmured, his voice flat and mechanical, completely devoid of inflection. "It watches through the bones. It watches through the bones." He repeated those words over and over, like a mantra or a curse, and nothing we said or did could make him stop. 2 days after we extracted him from Snowshoe Gulch, Eli was discovered wandering barefoot down an old logging road approximately 15 miles from where we'd found him. A truck driver spotted him. Thought at first he was looking at a ghost given how Eli appeared in the man's headlights, pale, emaciated, covered in frost, barely recognizable as human. The driver called the sheriff's department, and Eli was rushed to Kalispell Regional Medical Center suffering from severe frostbite, malnutrition, dehydration, and profound psychological trauma. When the doctors examined him, they found something that no one could adequately explain. Despite having walked miles through sub-zero temperatures on bare feet that should have been frozen solid, Eli's frostbite was relatively minor, localized, as if something had been protecting him even as it destroyed his mind. His physical injuries healed within weeks. His mind did not. He remembered nothing coherent about his time in the gulch, offering only fractured, disconnected phrases when questioned by the sheriff's department investigators. He spoke repeatedly about the Tall One, about the Eater of Men, about the Circle of Bones and the Watching Place. None of it made sense to anyone except me, Nathan, and Jesse, and we weren't talking to investigators about what we'd experienced. What would we say? How could we explain something we didn't understand ourselves? Greg Weller's body was never recovered. Search teams spent 3 days combing the area where we'd last seen him, employing dogs, thermal imaging, even bringing in a helicopter once the weather cleared. They found nothing. No body, no blood, no signs of struggle, no tracks, nothing. It was as if he'd simply ceased to exist the moment we'd left him behind in that clearing. His family held a memorial service without a body, his wife and 2 young daughters standing beside an empty casket, grieving for a man who'd vanished as completely as if he'd been erased from reality. Nathan Two Feathers never returned to Flathead National Forest. I heard through mutual acquaintances that he'd left Montana entirely, moving to the Blackfeet Reservation near Browning, where he lived with extended family, and refused to discuss what happened in Snowshoe Gulch. He'd left a brief note at my house the day after we'd brought Eli out, written in careful handwriting on lined paper torn from a notebook. It read simply, "What we woke cannot be put back to sleep. Stay away from that place, Caleb. Don't go back for any reason. Some hungers can never be satisfied, only avoided. I pray for your brother, but I fear he brought something back with him." I never saw Nathan again after that. 3 months later, I heard he'd passed away in his sleep. A massive heart attack, the coroner reported. Unusual for a man of only 43 with no history of heart problems. But I remembered the expression on his face when he'd stood between us and whatever hunted those woods, and I wondered if the heart attack was truly natural, or if facing that thing had broken something fundamental inside him that couldn't be repaired. Jesse Pruitt stopped working as a snowmobile guide entirely. He sold his machines and took a job at a hardware store in town, spending his days indoors beneath fluorescent lights, as far from the wilderness as he could manage while still living in Montana. The few times I saw him around town, he wouldn't meet my eyes, would cross the street to avoid conversation. The trauma had hollowed him out, left him a shell of the confident outdoorsman I'd known my entire life. The official investigation into the disappearances concluded that Eric Halstead had likely died of exposure due to getting separated from his guide in poor weather conditions. Eli's mental state was attributed to the trauma of watching his client die and his own struggle to survive in extreme conditions. Greg Weller's disappearance remained listed as an unsolved missing persons case, with the assumption that he'd suffered some kind of accident in the treacherous terrain of Snowshoe Gulch. The official reports made no mention of the arranged bones, the circling presence, the voice in the trees. Those details stayed with those of us who'd been there, locked away in nightmares we couldn't share. Weeks after the incident, I finally gathered the courage to visit Eli at the psychiatric facility in Kalispell where he'd been committed for ongoing treatment. The building was modern, clean, painted in calming pastels that seemed grotesquely inappropriate given the suffering housed within its walls. A nurse led me through security doors that locked automatically behind us, down corridors that smelled of disinfectant and despair, to a common room where Eli sat alone at a table near a window. He'd gained back some of the weight he'd lost. His hair had been cut neatly, his beard trimmed, but his eyes remained distant, haunted, constantly watching something no one else could see. He wore soft gray clothing without buttons or strings, institutional attire designed to prevent self-harm. His hands trembled continuously on the table in front of him. When I sat down across from him, he didn't acknowledge my presence at first. His eyes remained fixed on the window, though the curtains had been drawn, blocking any view of the outside world. I noticed immediately that his chair had been positioned so his back was never to an open space, never toward a doorway where something might approach unseen. "Eli," I said softly, "it's me. It's Caleb." His eyes slowly shifted to focus on my face, recognition flickering briefly in their depths before fading back to that distant stare. His lips moved, forming words too quiet to hear at first. "The tall one knows you came," he whispered finally, his voice flat and mechanical. "It watched you leave. It remembers your scent, your face. It's patient. It can wait years, decades. Time means nothing to the eater of men." My blood went cold at his words, but I forced myself to speak calmly. "Eli, you're safe here. Whatever was out there can't reach you anymore. You're protected." His laugh was bitter, empty, a sound that barely qualified as human. "Protected? There's no protection from what sleeps in those mountains. It's older than the tribes, older than the trees themselves. It was there before humans came to these lands, and it will be there long after we're gone." He finally turned to look at me directly, and what I saw in his eyes made me want to flee from that room, from that building, from this entire state. There was knowledge there, terrible knowledge. The kind of understanding that breaks human minds because we're not designed to comprehend such things. "You want to know what I remember?" Eli asked, his voice suddenly clearer, more present than I'd heard since we'd found him. "I remember being called. Eric heard it too, that voice in the wind, speaking words that weren't quite words but that we understood anyway. It promised us something, truth, knowledge, understanding of the forest and everything in it. We followed the voice for hours, days maybe. Time stopped making sense." He paused, his hands trembling more violently, jaw clenching as if the words caused him physical pain to speak. "We found the circle of bones. Hundreds of skeletons arranged in perfect geometric patterns, some fresh, some ancient, all positioned with purpose. Human bones, animal bones, bones from creatures I couldn't identify. And in the center stood the tall one, waiting, always hungry. "Eli, please," I started, but he cut me off with a sharp gesture. It showed us what it was, what it had always been. A guardian, it called itself. A keeper of boundaries between the world we know and the world beneath, the world that existed before creation and will exist after the end. It said we'd violated its territory, broken old agreements our ancestors made when they first came to these mountains. It said payment was required. Tears began streaming down Eli's face, though his expression remained blank, detached as if his body was crying while his mind observed from a distance. Eric ran. The tall one let him run because the chase feeds it. The fear makes the meat sweeter. I stayed. I couldn't move. It touched me. Caleb. It put its hand on my head, and I felt everything: centuries of hunger, millennia of patience, the endless cold of something that exists outside of time. It showed me everyone who'd ever entered its territory. everyone who died in those woods, and it showed me everyone who would die there in the future. I saw you, Caleb. I saw you standing in that clearing, and I saw what the Tall One wanted to do to you. Eli, stop. It let me go, he continued, his voice rising slightly. It marked me and let me go because I'm a message. A warning. It wanted you to know that it's awake now, fully awake for the first time in generations. It wanted you to know that Snowshoe Gulch is just the beginning. The watching place is expanding, reclaiming territory it lost when humans pushed into these mountains, and there's nothing anyone can do to stop it. I sat in stunned silence, unable to process what I was hearing. Part of me wanted to dismiss his words as delusions, the product of a broken mind trying to make sense of trauma it couldn't understand. But I'd been there. I'd heard the circling footsteps, felt the weight of those ancient eyes watching from the darkness. I knew in my bones that what Eli described was real, impossibly real. The nurses think I'm afraid of windows, Eli said suddenly, his tone shifting to something almost conversational. That's why they keep the curtains closed in my room, why they position my chair this way. But that's not it at all. I refuse to look outside because I know what I'll see. Not every time, not even most times, but sometimes, when the light hits just right, I see it standing at the tree line, watching, waiting. The Tall One never forgets, it never forgives, and it never stops hunting once it's chosen prey. A nurse appeared at the door, signaling that visiting hours were ending. I stood slowly, my legs unsteady, my mind reeling. As I prepared to leave, Eli reached out suddenly, grabbing my wrist with surprising strength, his eyes locking onto mine with terrible intensity. You can't see it unless it wants you to, he whispered urgently, his words tumbling out in a rush. But you can always feel it. You'll know when it's close because the world goes silent, completely silent, like the forest is holding its breath. And when you feel that silence, Caleb, you need to run. Don't stop to fight. Don't turn around to look. Just run and pray you're fast enough. Pray the Eater of Men isn't hungry enough to chase you down. His grip tightened painfully on my wrist, fingernails digging into my skin. But the worst part? The worst part is knowing that it's always there, always watching from just beyond the trees, just beyond the edge of sight. Patient, ancient, hungry, waiting for the moment when you let your guard down, when you forget to watch the tree line, when you make the mistake of going back into its territory. Because once it's marked you, Caleb, you can never truly leave. Part of you belongs to the watching place forever. The nurse stepped forward, gently prying Eli's fingers from my wrist, murmuring soothing words. Eli released his grip, his moment of intensity fading as quickly as it had come. His eyes went distant again, unfocused, staring at things I couldn't see. As I walked toward the door, he spoke one last time, his voice barely a whisper. It waits behind the cold, Caleb. It waits behind the cold. I left him there in that sterile room, surrounded by people who thought they understood his trauma but had no concept of the truth he carried. I walked through those locked corridors, through those security doors, out into the parking lot and the bright afternoon sunshine that suddenly felt insufficient, too weak to drive away the shadows I could still feel gathering at the edges of my vision. That was 3 months ago. I haven't been back to visit Eli since, though the guilt of that abandonment weighs on me daily. I've avoided Flathead National Forest entirely, sticking to roads and civilization, spending my nights under artificial lights in town. But no matter where I go, no matter how far I stay from those mountains, I can feel it still, that presence, that attention, the weight of ancient eyes watching from places I can't see. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, I wake up certain I've heard something circling my house, heavy footsteps crunching through gravel just beyond the reach of the porch light. I'll stand at my window, staring out into the darkness between the houses, searching the shadows for any sign of movement. And sometimes, when the wind is right and the night is silent enough, I swear I can hear it calling, using a voice that sounds almost like Eli's, almost like Nathan's, almost like Greg's. It waits behind the cold. That's what Eli said, and now I finally understand what he meant. Not behind the temperature, not behind the snow or ice, behind the cold that exists in places humans were never meant to go. In the spaces between stars and beneath ancient trees. In the darkness that existed before light and will exist after the last sun dies. The Eater of Men waits there, patient and eternal. And now that I've walked through its territory, now that I've seen its work and fled its presence, I carry a piece of that cold with me everywhere I go. I tell myself I'll never return to Snowshoe Gulch. I tell myself I'm safe here in town, surrounded by people and lights and the comfortable illusions of civilization. But late at night, when sleep refuses to come, and every shadow seems to move with purpose, I remember Eli's words, his warning that once the Tall One has marked you, You can never truly leave. And I wonder with growing dread, how long it will wait before it comes to collect what it believes it's owed. Because something is different now, since that expedition into the gulch. Sometimes when I'm alone, I'll feel that silence descending, that complete absence of sound that shouldn't exist in a living world. And in those moments of terrible quiet, I'll catch a glimpse, just a glimpse of something tall standing at the edge of sight, just beyond the tree line, perfectly still, watching with patient hunger. The eater of men is awake, and it remembers. I should have known better than to trust a Craigslist ad for a used RV, but I've never been the cautious type. My name is Travis Holcomb. Grew up in Detroit, where the only wildlife you worry about are the stray dogs and the occasional rats scurrying across the alley. Life has been tough, but I've made my way somehow. I work as a mechanic now, fixing up anything from old beaters to luxury imports at Johnson's Auto Shop on the east side. The work keeps my hands busy and my mind focused. But after 15 years of breathing in exhaust fumes and dealing with entitled customers, I needed a break, something different. The idea came to me during a particularly rough week at the shop. We had a string of difficult customers, the kind who think they know more about cars than someone who's been fixing them their whole life. Mike, my buddy from the paint shop, had just gotten back from a camping trip up in Maine. He wouldn't shut up about it. The peace and quiet, the stars at night, the way the world seemed to slow down out there. I'd never been much for nature, but something about the way he described it stuck with me. That night, scrolling through Craigslist on my phone, nursing a beer in my cramped apartment, I saw the ad. 1985 Winnebago Chieftain, minor repairs needed, $3,500 OBO. The price alone should have been my first warning. These things usually go for at least triple that, even in rough shape. But I've always been the type to see an opportunity where others see red flags. The drive out to see it took me deep into rural Pennsylvania, through winding roads that seemed to get narrower with each passing mile. The GPS signal kept cutting out, leaving me to navigate by the crude directions the seller had provided. The property itself was exactly what you'd expect. A ramshackle farmhouse set back from the road, paint peeling, gutters hanging loose, surrounded by tall grass that hadn't seen a mower in years. The owner, Walter Pritchard, was a rail-thin man who looked ancient enough to have witnessed the Civil War. His handshake was surprisingly firm, though, and his eyes were sharp despite the deep wrinkles surrounding them. Been trying to sell her for months, he said, leading me around back where the RV sat. Wife passed last year. No use for it anymore. The Winnebago had definitely seen better days. The once white exterior had faded to a sickly yellow, with rust creeping up from the wheel wells. The awning was torn, hanging by a few threads, and there was a dent in the passenger side that suggested an intimate encounter with a tree. But I knew these old chieftains. They were built like tanks, and the 454 Chevy engine under the hood was practically bulletproof. Walter seemed eager to get rid of it, hovering nearby as I did my inspection. The interior was musty, but surprisingly clean, with that peculiar smell old RVs get, a mixture of aged vinyl, propane, and memories. The engine turned over after a few tries, coughing to life like an old man waking from a deep sleep. I checked the essentials. Frame was solid. Transmission shifted smoothly enough, and the generator still ran. Nothing I couldn't fix with a few days' work. $3,000, I offered, knowing full well it was worth more even in this condition. Walter didn't even try to negotiate. He just nodded, already pulling the title from his back pocket like he'd been waiting for this moment. As I counted out the cash, his hand trembled slightly, and for a moment something passed across his face. Was it relief? Guilt? But then it was gone, replaced by that pleasant elderly smile. "One more thing," he said, as I was about to leave. "Best stick to the established campgrounds. Some of these back roads," he trailed off, shaking his head. "Well, just be careful where you park her for the night." I should have asked what he meant by that. Should have pressed him for details. But I was too excited about my purchase, already planning the repairs in my head. I drove the RV home that afternoon, the steering loose but manageable, the engine running rough but steady. Over the next 2 weeks, I spent every free moment working on it. New belts, fresh fluids, rebuilt carburetor, patched the roof leaks, and replaced the worst of the rusty panels. By the time I was done, she wasn't pretty, but she was reliable, or so I thought. I planned my trip carefully, or at least I thought I did. The Allegheny National Forest seemed perfect for a first-time camper, close enough to civilization that I wouldn't feel completely isolated, but far enough out to get that wilderness experience Mike had talked about. I packed tools, spare parts, enough food for a week, and my old hunting knife, a habit from growing up in Detroit where you never went anywhere without some kind of protection. The drive up was uneventful. The RV handled well enough on the highway, though it drank gas like a drunk at last call. I arrived at the campground just as the sun was setting, the sky painting everything in deep purples and oranges. The ranger at the entrance station barely looked up from his magazine as he took my camping fee and handed me a map with my spot marked Miners, Site 47, one of the more isolated spots in the grounds. It took some maneuvering to back the RV into the spot, but I managed it without hitting any trees. The site was beautiful, I had to admit. Tall pines surrounded three sides, with a small clearing that opened up to the sky. As night fell, the stars came out, more than I'd ever seen in my life. The city boy in me felt small under that vast expanse of sky. That first night was peaceful, almost eerily so. The silence was complete in a way I'd never experienced before. No traffic noise, no sirens, no neighbors arguing through paper-thin walls. Just the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind, and the soft hooting of an owl somewhere in the distance. I slept better than I had in years. The trouble started on the second day. I'd spent the morning doing some preventive maintenance on the RV, checking fluids and adjusting the carburetor. Everything looked fine, but when I tried to start it, nothing. Not even a click from the starter. Strange, considering it had been running perfectly just the day before. I popped the hood again, checking the obvious things first. Battery connections, starter solenoid, fuel pump. Everything looked normal. That's when I first felt it. That sensation of being watched. You know that feeling when the hair on the back of your neck stands up. Like that, but worse. I looked around, expecting to see another camper or maybe a ranger, but there was nothing. Just trees and lengthening shadows as the afternoon wore on. I told myself I was being paranoid, and went back to work on the engine. But the feeling persisted, growing stronger as the day progressed. By evening, I'd given up on fixing the RV for the day. The light was failing, and my flashlight batteries were running low. I retreated inside, securing the door behind me more firmly than necessary. The interior of the RV felt safe, familiar. I fired up the propane stove and made dinner, just some instant noodles and coffee, but it helped settle my nerves. I tried to read but couldn't focus on the words. That's when I first heard it, that sound that would haunt my dreams for months to come. It started as a low vibration, more felt than heard, like the hum of high-voltage power lines. But there were no power lines out here, nothing that could explain that sound. It grew gradually louder, taking on a quality that made my teeth ache. Not mechanical, not natural, something in between, something wrong. My first instinct was to grab my flashlight and investigate. Stupid, maybe, but I've never been good at sitting still when something's wrong. The beam cut through the darkness outside, catching glimpses of movement just beyond its reach. Something was out there, moving between the trees with a fluid grace that seemed impossible for its size. I'd seen plenty of wildlife documentaries, knew what bears and wolves looked like when they moved. This was different. Its gait was wrong, like watching a puppet being manipulated by someone who'd only heard descriptions of how four-legged animals should move. The proportions were all wrong too tall, too lean, with limbs that seemed to bend at impossible angles. The beam of my flashlight caught it fully for just a moment. What I saw made my mind recoil, trying to reject the image even as it burned itself into my memory. It had the basic shape of a wolf, but stretched and distorted like a reflection in a funhouse mirror. Its fur was patchy, revealing something underneath that glistened wetly in the light. But it was the face that haunted me. Too long, too human-like in its expressions, with eyes that held an intelligence that no animal should possess. It knew I was watching it. Worse, it wanted me to see it. The creature turned those eyes directly on me, and in that moment, I understood what prey feels like in those last seconds before the predator strikes. My flashlight flickered, the beam growing weak, and I backed toward the RV door, never taking my eyes off the thing in the woods. Once inside, I locked every door and window, pulled down all the shades. My phone showed no signal. Of course not. I was miles from the nearest cell tower. The satellite radio was just static, and the CB radio I'd installed as a backup produced nothing but white noise and that same strange hum I'd heard earlier. The night stretched on endlessly. Every creak of the RV's frame, every whisper of wind against the metal walls, sent my heart racing. I sat in the darkness, clutching my hunting knife, a K-bar I'd bought years ago after a break-in at my apartment. The blade seemed pathetically inadequate against whatever was out there, but it was all I had. Around 3 a.m., the scratching started. At first it was subtle, could have been branches scraping against the roof. But it grew more deliberate, methodical, like something was testing the RV's weak points. I heard it moving along the roof, its weight making the ceiling creak. Then it moved to the windows, tapping against the glass with something that sounded more like fingers than claws. The worst part was the silence between the sounds. In those moments I could hear my own breathing, too loud in the confined space, and the pounding of my heart that seemed to echo off the walls. I kept thinking about Walter, the old man who sold me the RV. He must have known, the way he'd practically pushed me to buy it. His cryptic warning about where to park, it all made sense now. Dawn couldn't come fast enough. When the first gray light filtered through the blinds, the scratching had stopped. I waited another hour before working up the courage to step outside. The morning was crisp and clear, deceptively normal, but the evidence was there. Deep scratches in the RV's metal siding, some high up where no normal animal could reach. And the engine compartment. God, the engine compartment. I'm a mechanic. I've seen every kind of engine damage imaginable. Accidents, vandalism, even animals nesting in engine bays. This was different. The wiring harness had been shredded with surgical precision. Hoses were cut, not torn. The fuel lines were twisted into complex knots that would have taken tools and time to create. This wasn't random damage. It was deliberate sabotage. My hands shook as I tried to repair what I could, but it was hopeless. Whatever that thing was, it had effectively trapped me here. The nearest ranger station was about 10 miles away, a long hike through dense forest, but what choice did I have? I packed a backpack with essentials: water, some protein bars, my knife, a cheap compass I'd bought as a backup, and a can of bear spray that now seemed laughably inadequate. The first mile wasn't so bad. The main trail was well marked, and the morning sun provided some comfort. But as I went deeper into the forest, things began to change. The trees seemed to grow closer together, their branches interweaving overhead until only occasional shafts of sunlight penetrated the canopy. The air grew thick and heavy, carrying a musty smell like wet fur and decay. That's when I noticed the silence. No birds singing, no squirrels rustling through the branches. Even the insects had gone quiet. The forest was holding its breath, waiting. The hum returned, stronger now, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. My compass began to spin wildly, the needle rotating in complete circles, as if searching for a north that no longer existed. I quickened my pace, no longer caring about staying on the trail. My only thought was putting distance between myself and whatever was pursuing me. But with each step, the forest seemed to shift around me, the trees moving when I wasn't looking directly at them, paths appearing and disappearing like a maze that rearranged itself when I blinked. The creature appeared ahead of me so suddenly I almost ran straight into it. One moment the trail was empty. The next it stood there, its massive form blocking the path completely. In the daylight it was even more horrifying than what I'd glimpsed the night before. Its body was a contradiction. Parts of it seemed solid, covered in matted gray fur, while other sections appeared almost transparent, like smoke given form. Its legs bent backward at joints that shouldn't exist, and its head housed a face that kept shifting between wolf and something almost human, never settling on either. But it was the eyes that paralyzed me. Yellow-green orbs that held an ancient intelligence, studying me with a predator's calculating patience. This wasn't just some forest creature. There was purpose in those eyes, a malevolent awareness that spoke of centuries of hunting, of toying with prey. My hand tightened on the knife in my pocket. The creature's head tilted slightly, almost curiously, as if it recognized the gesture. Then it did something that chilled me to my core. It smiled. Not a wolf's snarl, but an actual smile, revealing rows of teeth that were too sharp, too numerous, arranged in patterns that defied biology. I ran. Not my proudest moment, but instinct took over. I crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face, roots trying to tangle my feet. I could hear it behind me, not running but moving in a way that seemed to bend space, appearing in glimpses between trees, always keeping pace without seeming to hurry. The cabin appeared through the trees like a mirage, a decrepit structure of weathered wood and broken windows. I didn't question its convenient appearance, I just ran for it. The door was swollen in its frame, but desperation gave me strength. I slammed it behind me, wedging a broken chair under the handle for whatever good it might do. The cabin's interior was a single room, thick with dust and cobwebs. Afternoon light filtered through the grimy windows, illuminating dancing motes in the air. Old furniture lay scattered about a bed frame with a rotted mattress, a table on its side, shelves lined with rusted cans and moldering books. But what caught my eye was the rifle mounted above the stone fireplace. I reached for it just as the door began to splinter. The creature wasn't being subtle anymore. It was coming through, wood cracking under immense pressure. The rifle was an old lever action, the kind you see in Western movies. A quick check revealed it was loaded. The brass cartridges green with age but still solid. The door exploded inward as I brought the rifle up. The creature filled the doorway, its form seeming to shift and flow like smoke, but there was nothing insubstantial about the claws that had reduced the door to splinters. I fired without thinking, the rifle's report deafening in the confined space. The creature jerked backward, dark blood spraying from its chest. The wound seemed to steam in the cool air, releasing a smell like burning metal and rotting leaves. For a moment, the thing looked almost surprised, its form becoming more solid, more real. Then it screamed. The sound was impossible, a mixture of wolf's howl, human scream, and something else. Something that made the air itself vibrate. It lunged forward, covering the distance between us in a single bound. The rifle was torn from my hands, clattering across the floor. Hot breath washed over my face, carrying the stench of decay, and something metallic, like old pennies. We grappled, its strength overwhelming but somehow not quite solid, like wrestling with a nightmare-given form. My knife was in my hand. I don't remember drawing it, and I struck blindly, feeling the blade sink into flesh that seemed to both resist and yield at the same time. The creature's blood was hot, almost burning where it splashed against my skin. It thrashed, its form flickering between solid and ethereal. But I held on, driving the blade deeper, twisting it with all my strength. The scream this time was different, pain and rage giving way to something almost like surprise. It collapsed, its massive form shuddering, parts of it seeming to dissolve into smoke while others became more solid, more real. The transformation was horrifying. Patches of fur falling away to reveal skin that looked almost human, limbs twisting and reshaping themselves. In its final moments, its face became almost recognizable, wearing an expression of what might have been relief before it finally went still. I don't remember much about the walk to the ranger station. I was operating on autopilot, my mind trying to process what had happened while simultaneously trying to forget it. The rangers found me wandering along the road, covered in blood and babbling about monsters in the woods. They probably would have dismissed me as another crazy tourist, but something in my eyes must have convinced them to investigate. They found the cabin, though it took them several attempts to locate it. The creature's body was there, but it had changed in death, becoming something that defied easy explanation. The official report called it an unknown species of wolf, possibly deformed by disease or mutation. The cabin itself was declared unsafe and demolished a week later. I never went back to get the RV, let the forest have it. Sometimes I wonder if Walter is still out there, still selling that cursed vehicle to unsuspecting buyers. I've thought about trying to find him, to demand answers, but part of me knows I wouldn't find that farmhouse again. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. I still work as a mechanic, still fix other people's vehicles, but I've developed a peculiar habit. I always check the engine compartments for signs of tampering, for knots in the wiring that shouldn't be there. And sometimes late at night when I'm alone in the shop, I hear that low hum again, coming from somewhere in the darkness beyond the fluorescent lights. I keep my knife close these days, and I never ever go camping.